To all the free roamers, the swamp dwellers, the tired souls currently huddled in the irradiated basements of Pripyat to escape the black rain, this is Tina. You are listening to the echo of the zone frequency. Tonight, I'm not going to talk about the price of artifacts at the local trader. I'm not going to talk about the latest skirmish between duty and freedom near the Rostock checkpoints, and I won't be giving out tips on how to calibrate your headlamps. Tonight, I want to talk about something much more fundamental. I want to talk about the silence. Not the empty silence of a dead room where you can hear your own pulse. No, I'm talking about the heavy, expectant silence of the Red Forest, the kind of silence that feels like a weight pressing against your eardrums, where the very air seems to be holding its breath, waiting for you to stumble. This is a story from my early days, a time I look back on with a mix of shame and terror. Back then, I still carried my original, bolt-action rifle, a piece of rusted history I loved more than my own life. I had a heart full of that stupid, dangerous confidence that only rookies possess. I thought I knew what fear was. I'd seen a bloodsucker shimmer in the tall grass. I'd heard the brain-melting psychic hum of a controller near the old labs. I believed that if I could see a threat, I could kill it. I believed the zone was a puzzle that could be solved with a steady hand and a sharp eye. But the zone is not a puzzle. It is a predator. And it doesn't always give you the luxury of a target to aim at. It happened on the northern fringes of the Red Forest, a place where the trees are so saturated with radiation they've turned a sickly, bruised ginger color. It was one of those rare, cursed days where the sun actually manages to pierce through the thick, toxic haze of the atmosphere. The light didn't feel warm, it felt surgical, casting long, razor-sharp shadows through the warped pines. I was on a solo scouting run, attempting to map a bypass route around the main road where the bandit patrols were getting too thick for comfort. At that moment, I felt invincible. My rucksack was heavy with canned beef and fresh ammunition. I had a map that had cost me far too many rubles, and I was making good time. I reached a particular clearing where the trees looked more like petrified lightning than wood. Their trunks spiraled upward in agonizing twists, as if they had spent the last 30 years trying to crawl out of the radioactive soil to escape what lay beneath. The ground was covered in a thick carpet of orange moss that muffled every footstep. I decided to stop by a massive, hollowed-out oak tree. It was a giant among the stunted pines, a remnant of the forest before the world broke. I leaned my rifle against a gnarled root, sat down, and pulled out my flask. The air was unnaturally still. In the zone, total silence is usually a death sentence. It means the birds have fled and the mutants are hunkered down. But in my arrogance, I let my guard down. I tilted my head back, closing my eyes for a second, enjoying the phantom sensation of the sun on my skin. I felt like the master of my own little kingdom. And then, the shift happened. You know that sensation, don't you? That sudden, icy prickle that starts at the base of your spine and crawls up between your shoulder blades. The absolute, undeniable certainty that you are no longer the only consciousness in the room. It wasn't the feeling of a predator stalking you from the bushes 50 meters away. It was something much more intimate, much more invasive. It felt as though someone was standing exactly 3 inches behind the nape of my neck, leaning in, holding their breath just to see how long it would take for me to notice. I froze. I didn't reach for my gun. I didn't even move my fingers. I just sat there, every nerve ending in my body screaming for me to run, but my muscles were locked in a state of primal paralysis. I listened. I strained my hearing until my ears rang, hoping to hear a branch snap, the rustle of a heavy cloak, or even the click of a safety being moved. Nothing. The forest remained a silent tomb. The only sound in the world was the distant, erratic crackle of the Geiger counter on my belt, ticking like a frantic heart. I slowly turned my head, millimeter by millimeter, scanning the perimeter of the clearing. The forest looked like a stagnant postcard of ruin. Everything seemed to be exactly where it belonged. But as my eyes tracked across the shadows cast by the afternoon sun, my breath hitched in my throat. I noticed one particular pine tree, about 10 meters to my left. Its shadow was wrong. It was too thick, too dense. While the other shadows were gray and diffused by the haze, this one was a void, a pitch-black stain that seemed to bleed into the earth with a physical weight. It didn't taper off with the angle of the light. It seemed to be anchored to the ground by a density that defied the laws of physics. I tried to tell myself it was just the zone eye, the way the radiation messes with your retinas after too many hours in the field. I forced myself to stand up, my hands trembling as I gripped the cold steel of my rifle. I didn't run. I took a step forward, intending to continue my path. But as my boot hit the moss, I felt the air behind me displace. It wasn't a wind. It was a pressure wave, as if I were dragging an invisible, heavy curtain behind my back. Something was moving with me. Something was staying perfectly synchronized with my own gait, mimicking my tempo, waiting for the exact moment I would stop again. I realized then that I wasn't just being followed. I was being shadowed by something that lived in the space I couldn't see. I looked at the thick shadow by the pine tree again, and this time, I saw it move. It didn't step out. It didn't reveal a limb. It simply shifted within itself, like ink swirling in a glass of water. I realized that the shadow wasn't being cast by the tree. The tree was just the thing it was hiding behind. And as I turned my body to face it, the shadow glided around the trunk, keeping the wood between us with a speed that was sickeningly fluid. It was a dance, and I was the one about to lose my lead. I tried to swallow, but my mouth felt like it was filled with the dry, metallic dust of the red forest. I gripped the forestock of my rifle until the checkering bit into my palms, praying for a sound, any sound that I could identify as human or mutant. But the zone didn't oblige. I tried to convince myself I was just succumbing to a classic case of zone frenzy. We've all seen it happen to the greenhorns. The sensory deprivation, the constant, low-level thrum of background radiation, and the way the ionized air makes your brain feel like it's simmering in a slow cooker. You start seeing faces in the rust and hearing voices in the wind. I told myself that the thick, ink-black shadow I had seen was just a trick of the light, a byproduct of a tired mind trying to find patterns in a place that had long ago abandoned logic. I started walking again, pushing deeper toward the northern edge where the pines began to give way to skeletal, white-barked birches. My boots thudded rhythmically against the orange moss, but the rhythm was wrong. Every time my left foot hit the ground, I felt a faint, secondary vibration an instant later. A double tap on the earth. Something was walking behind me, mimicking my pace with terrifying precision. It wasn't trying to hide the sound of its movement, it was trying to hide the source. I decided to play a game, a desperate, amateur attempt at tactical awareness. I would count my steps, then spin around with my rifle raised and my finger on the trigger. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I spun. Nothing. Only the shifting fog and the twisted silhouettes of dead trees. I stood there for a full minute, scanning the brush through my optics. Empty. I did it again, this time waiting for 10 steps. Again, nothing. I felt like a fool, a rookie dancing with ghosts in a graveyard. I cursed my own paranoia, but as soon as I turned my back to continue the trek, that icy prickle returned to my neck. It was more than a feeling, it was a physical weight. I could feel the displacement of air, the subtle change in atmospheric pressure that occurs when something massive stands directly in your path, or in this case, directly in your wake. It was staying in that razor-thin sliver of space I couldn't see. My blind spot. No matter how fast I turned, it moved faster. It was as if we were connected by an invisible rod, a predatory tether that ensured I could never face my stalker. I eventually reached a section of the forest that looked like it had been bleached by a god. The trees here were thinner, mostly birches that had been scorched white by decades of fallout. There was no undergrowth, just a flat expanse of grey soil and thin, vertical trunks. I saw a tree about 20 meters ahead, its trunk barely wider than my own waist. It was the only cover for yards. I watched it intently as I approached, my eyes never leaving the edges of the white bark. I was sure of it now. I could see the tip of something protruding from behind the tree. It was a limb impossibly long, skeletal, and covered in a grey, fibrous skin that looked more like wet parchment or fungal growth than living flesh. I stopped dead in my tracks. I didn't reach for a bolt. I didn't check my dosimeter. I just raised my rifle and leveled it at the tree. "Hey!" I shouted. My voice sounded small, brittle, and pathetic against the vast, oppressive silence of the northern zone. "I see you. I know you're there, you son of a bitch. Come out and face me." The response was not a roar. It wasn't a snarl. It was something far worse. The creature didn't jump out to attack. Instead, it began to move with a fluid, mechanical grace that made my stomach lurch into my throat. As I stepped to the right, desperate to get a better angle around the birch trunk, the creature shifted to the left at the exact same velocity. It kept the thin wood perfectly between us. I stepped left, it stepped right. It was a mirrored dance of death. I started circling the tree, moving faster and faster, my boots kicking up clouds of ash. I was sprinting in a circle, my rifle pointed at a target that was always just 1 inch out of view. It was too fast. It moved like a shadow caught in a strobe light, jittery, instantaneous, and completely silent. And then, the silence was finally, mercifully broken. Just as I stopped, leaning against a nearby stump, exhausted and gasping for air, I heard it. The wind had died down completely. The distant crackle of anomalies had faded. In that perfect, terrifying void, I heard a sound right against the curve of my ear. A soft, wet, wheezing inhalation. It was the sound of air being pulled through a throat filled with fluid. It didn't come from behind the birch tree 20 meters away. It didn't come from the bushes. It came from the empty, open air directly behind my head. It was the sound of a predator that had finally stopped hiding behind the trees, because it was now hiding behind me. The breath. That wet, ragged intake of air right against my skin was the moment my mind finally snapped. I didn't think about my training. I didn't think about my rifle or the expensive map in my pocket. I didn't even think about the anomalies that could turn me into a red mist in a fraction of a second. I just ran. I bolted into the thickest, most suffocating part of the brush, my legs moving with a desperate, animal strength I haven't felt since. Branches, hardened and blackened by decades of high-level radiation, tore at my face and my gear like the fingers of 1,000 tiny skeletons. I didn't care. I could hear it behind me, the heavy, rhythmic thud-thud-thud of something heavy keeping pace with my every stride. But here was the true horror. Every single time I risked a glance over my shoulder, every time I nearly twisted my neck off to catch a glimpse of my pursuer, the trail was empty. The forest was a graveyard of silence the moment I looked back. It was as if the creature only existed in the vacuum of my own perception. It was the Hidebehind, a legend from the old world that had found a new, terrible life in the irradiated womb of the zone. It was a physical impossibility, a predator that lived exclusively in the corners of my eyes, a ghost made of weight and hunger. I was running through springboard and burner anomalies without even checking my bolts, my heart hammering so hard against my ribs I thought the bone would give way. I was no longer a stalker. I was no longer the brave girl from the Instagram photos. I was just prey, screaming in my head for a god I didn't believe in. The light was failing fast now. In the zone, dusk doesn't fall, it descends like a heavy, bruised shroud. The orange moss of the forest floor turned to a deep, bloody crimson, and the white birch trees started to look like the bars of a vast, infinite cage. I reached a slope where the earth had been torn open by some ancient tectonic shift or perhaps a particularly violent blowout. A gnarled root, mutated and hard as industrial iron, caught the toe of my boot. I went down hard. The impact was visceral. I felt the air leave my lungs in a sharp, painful whistle. I slid through the radioactive muck, the smell of ozone and decaying peat filling my senses. My rifle, my beautiful, rusted bolt-action, flew out of my hands, clattering through the thick, grey ferns. I heard it hit a rock and splash into a hidden pool of fruit punch acid. I watched the faint green glow of the anomaly begin to eat away at the wood and steel. I was disarmed. I was broken. And I was completely exposed. I scrambled to my feet, spinning around in a frantic, blurred circle, my hands clawing for the Makarov pistol on my belt. My vision was swimming, my lungs burning with the acidic mist of the forest. I saw a massive redwood tree nearby, its bark rough and cold, its trunk wide enough to shield 3 men. I threw myself against it, pressing my spine into the wood until the bark bit through my jacket. I stared into the darkening forest, my eyes wide, searching for the slightest ripple in the fog. "Where are you?" I screamed, my voice cracking into a jagged, pathetic sob that echoed through the dead trees. "Show yourself, you coward. Kill me and be done with it." The forest went silent again. The wind, which had been howling through the canopy, died down into a suffocating stillness. Even the crows, those iron-feathered scavengers that usually thrive on misery, had stopped their mocking calls. I felt the rough bark of the tree against my back, and for a fleeting, delusional moment, I felt safe. I thought that if I kept my back to the solid wood, the creature couldn't get behind me. I thought I had finally found the one place where its rules didn't apply. I stood there for what felt like hours, my finger trembling so violently on the trigger of my pistol that I feared it would discharge by accident. I watched the shadows grow and merge, turning every stump into a monster and every branch into a reaching hand. And then, I felt it. A light, delicate pressure on my right shoulder. It wasn't a shove. It wasn't a strike. It was a soft, almost affectionate touch. I slowly, agonizingly lowered my gaze. From around the side of the very tree I was leaning against, the tree that was supposed to be my shield, a hand was slowly emerging. It was long, impossibly thin, with skin the color of a drowned man, so translucent I could see the dark, sluggish fluid moving through its vestigial veins. The fingers had too many joints, clicking softly as they moved, and they ended in sharp, blackened claws that looked like they were made of obsidian. The creature wasn't trying to grab me yet. It was just resting its hand there, claiming me. It was then I realized the ultimate, sanity-shattering horror of the Hidebehind. It wasn't just behind the trees anymore. It was behind me. It was using my own body, my own physical form, as the shield to hide from my sight. No matter which way I turned, no matter how fast I spun, I was the one carrying the monster on my back. The touch, it wasn't cold like ice. It was cold like deep water, a light, damp pressure that seemed to drain the heat directly out of my marrow. I sat there, pinned against that massive redwood, watching those impossibly long, pale fingers rest on my shoulder. I could see the blackened, sharp claws, obsidian needles that looked like they were grown from the very radiation that poisons this land. My mind was a shattered mirror, reflecting only one thought: I am the shield. I was the very thing protecting the monster from my own sight. I didn't turn around. I knew with a bone-deep certainty that if I tried to look into its face, the creature would simply vanish into the sliver of space behind my head, moving with that jittery, mechanical speed that defies every law of biology. It had spent the whole day playing a game of mirrors with me around every tree and bush, shifting its weight perfectly to stay hidden. Now, it had finally won. It didn't need a tree to hide behind anymore. It had me. My hand, slick with cold sweat and the radioactive mud of the red forest, gripped the hilt of my combat knife. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. I remembered how I had screamed at the empty birch trees earlier, my voice cracking as I begged the son of a bitch to show itself. I remembered the wet, wheezing inhalation that had answered me from the empty air behind my ear. I knew I had one chance before those fingers tightened and dragged me into the dark, just like the legends say the Hidebehind does to those who wander too far into the deep woods. I didn't swing forward. I didn't try to roll away. With a primal, wordless roar that felt like it was tearing my vocal cords, I reached back over my own shoulder and drove the blade into the space where the hand was coming from. I felt the steel sink into something that resisted like wet parchment and rotted wood. There was no blood, not red blood, anyway. Only a grey, translucent fluid that smelled like ozone and ancient dust sprayed across my jacket. A sound erupted from the dark. It wasn't a scream. It was a high-pitched, whistling moan, like the wind being forced through a cracked pipe. The pressure on my shoulder vanished. I didn't wait. I didn't look back to see if the creature was wounded or just fading into the shadows. I bolted. I ran through the darkness, my lungs burning as if I were inhaling shards of glass. I didn't check for anomalies. I didn't care about the burners or the springboards. I simply ran until the dense, suffocating trees of the red forest gave way to the rusted, jagged fences of the southern checkpoint. I reached the stalkers' camp at the bar looking like a ghost, eyes wide, covered in grey filth, and still clutching that stained knife. I didn't say a word to anyone for 3 days. I just sat by the fire in the 100 Rads bar, staring into the flames, making sure my back was always pressed against a solid concrete wall. Finally, an old veteran named Baroda sat down next to me. He looked at my knife, still stained with that translucent residue that refused to wash off. He didn't ask what happened. He just nodded and said, "You met the Hidebehind, didn't you, Tina? Most don't get to run. It doesn't want your meat, it wants your mind. It feeds on the terror of knowing you aren't alone, even when the world looks empty." I never went back to that part of the forest. But the zone doesn't let you go that easily. Even now, sitting here in this reinforced studio with the door locked and the monitors glowing, I can feel the displacement of the air. Sometimes, when the radio static gets too loud, or when I turn my head too quickly to check the signal, I see a sliver of grey in the corner of my eye, a shadow that doesn't belong to the furniture. A movement that stops the very millisecond I try to focus on it. So, listen to me, stalkers. When you're out there in the woods and you feel that sudden, icy prickle on the back of your neck, don't turn around. Don't play the game. Don't scream into the trees. Just keep walking. Keep your back to the light, and pray that the Hidebehind finds someone else's blind spot more interesting than yours. Because once it touches your shoulder, you never truly walk alone again. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and for the love of everything holy, never trust the silence. This has been Tina. End of broadcast.